nice and close, second row, first row. A little closer if you want. Don't worry, I won't embarrass anybody. I won't call on anybody. Stay right there if you're good to. Oh, there's Dina out there. By the way, I spent half an hour today as I just warm up here. Spent half an hour today in a class with eight-year-olds today. Your grandson was one of them, and it was fabulous. I went in. They had prepared a couple questions with the teacher that had to do with about Shabbat and about God, about creation. And the question was creation of people. Like, and how did that happen? And so I talked about the stories of the Torah and about creation, and then said, and told them about the breath of life, about the part of the story. And I said, but, and it's interesting, how early do you start talking to children with an intellectual honesty and inquiry? Right? The question being, when you say to them, I don't take that story literally true. Right? Isn't that interesting? And I was nervous about doing it. I often don't do it. I often do it with much older children. But then I found once I started doing that they actually were asking more meaningful questions. Isn't that interesting? Like, once they knew I would respond honestly, they began to ask the questions differently. And it was quite enlightening. And the teachers were just amazed at the questions that they continued to roll over on. And eventually, one of them at the end, and I'd love to get Emma's take on this, asked, why does God make people die? That's a profound question. Isn't that a profound question? I mean, and so talked about, and then I asked them, I said, how would you, anyone want to try and answer that question, why you think? And by the way, I talked also about, I said, I want you to teach you a big word today. And they repeated after me, the syllable is anthropomorphic. And I was very curious how that would come out at home once they tried to do it without me there. But I taught them about what happens when we use language, human language, to talk about God, including thinking about God as a he. So really trying to make them think honestly about God. And then they answered, they said, one kid, I want to say person, it's an 8-year-old, said, if people live forever, the world would there'd be too many people and not enough place or food for them. Well, that's pretty profound already. And then we talked about how once you understand that you can't delay everything, right, that every day becomes more special. Right, the idea, so when I joke with them, I said, if you, in their language, you have to joke a little bit with them. I said, sometimes you'd put off to tomorrow what you could do today. And so I said, imagine, like, you want to go visit Israel. You go, I have time. I'll wait till I'm like 200 years old. Right? Or, I want to go visit, the Grand Canyon. Oh, I got time. I'll wait till I'm like 300 years old. And like, I just kept it, and they kind of laughed at the humor, but to understand. And so we talked about it. It was really, you'll ask him and see whether he has any recollection. Like, you'll say, did Rabbi Vogel come talk to you in class? He goes, maybe, I don't know. But that'll be, right, the attention span. Ask him about anthropomorphic. All right, so we're supposed to be talking about, can you be Jewish and not believe in God? And as I look around, it's interesting. I didn't know who to expect here. Tonight, but I want you to answer briefly, why are you really here tonight? Like, it's an interesting, you can say it's just an interesting topic. What drew you, to come to tonight? What question, what issue, or just to hear me babble on? All right, so you can, go ahead, Dina. You want to hear other people's thoughts. Okay, Ben? There you go. You are here for teaching to fill in. By the way, I'm going to be repeating things because we are live streaming, and even if it's not tonight, we'll see about using it afterwards. So you missed the synagogue, and you wanted to be back. Charles. Yes, you are. So you're trying, I love the way you phrase it. I'm trying to get used to belief in God. I love the... I love the way you phrased it, Charles. I love the way you phrased it. I thought that was perfect, actually. Larry. You love discussions. That's fair, sure. Oh. And what? Okay, well, we're going to talk, like, you know how I teach. It's a little bit of a discussion, but we're going to talk more because it's important for you to be able to share. It helps process, Sherry. Great, learning from other people. Doc. I love being Jewish. I love Judaism deeply, but I don't know if I believe in God. Okay, that's great. Yeah, I'll tell you a story about that in a moment. Just this morning I met with a child of a congregant, but an adult, right, who's in his 40s, and his father just passed away, and talking about God, and he said, you know, I'm Jewish, but I don't believe in God. I said, oh, you wouldn't believe what I'm teaching here tonight. And he said, no, seriously, this just happened this morning. I said, I'm going to share this story. He said, I'm as Jewish as they come. You know? And it was fascinating. Linda? Okay. So you've got a strong opinion about belief in God, but you want to hear the other side. See if we can talk you out of believing in God? Because that's not the goal of tonight. I just want you to know. If you're coming with that in mind, I'm not working that angle. You can be Jewish without believing in God. Okay, Rob. Oh, the question behind the question, which is? Okay, so what is the concept of God and who is a Jew? Good. Yeah, not. Hmm. Right. I was talking with somebody about the class. They said, so, you know, the session night, they said, so just an answer, just go stand up there and go yes or no, and that's it. It's a very short, like, right? So what's the question behind the question? What is it? Yeah, no, it's good to get out in the rain. Yes, sir. Uh-huh. Now, oh, God. Okay, so Judaism in a connection with spirituality. So what is the distinction? We're going to talk a little bit about, and I have some statistics, by the way, from surveys and stuff, and the question of what is spirituality, which rabbis really don't like, often spirituality, because it's just like, what does that mean, to be spiritual? Because spiritual often doesn't translate into anything, right? It's, by the way, spirituality is self-fulfilling, right? Isn't it? Spirituality tends to be a feeling that you have about the world at large that is self-fulfilling in terms of helping you in the most positive ways do things, but it's usually directed inward, rather than outward, which is it was an interesting phenomenon. But in the question, we can talk about God. So, Michael, you want to follow up with that or no? I see you thinking, or you want to respond? Okay, hold on for a moment then. And what's your name? Sorry. Hi, Mark. And we like them. Everybody say hi, Mark. Hi, Mark. There you go. And so why did you come? You're interested in the topic. So where does space, matter, energy come from? Yeah. Okay. All right, good. I'm not here about proof of God. And the question is, why are you here tonight? Why did you come? Okay, God, Judaism, and spirituality. So we'll talk about that term, spirituality. Yes, Ben. It's okay. It's okay. Hmm. Right. So things happen a certain way. I'm repeating again for live streaming. Right. So, if certain things happened in your life, by the way, I would assume you meant always to the good. Now, it's interesting because in my theological evolution, it's always been I was stuck in that sort of, if you will, moment of conflict. If I believed that the good things came from God, what about the bad things? If I was going to be intellectually honest and consistent, wouldn't I have to apply it both ways? Why was I willing to give God the break in terms of the good things, but the bad things not? Which is where dualism comes from and a lot of other ideas. So let's step back for a moment and here, let's talk quickly. What does it mean to be Jewish? That's the question. What does it mean to be Jewish, Charles? Okay, so let's not qualify it to say for non-religious. Okay, well, those are very different things. So one is heredity and one is cultural. Those are separate issues, correct? Are those separate issues? Right, heredity means you're biologically Jewish, right? And by the way, by traditional Jewish standards, we talk about it being the mother, but we could say equally the father. I mean, why does DNA from one make a difference in terms of DNA from the other? If you're just thinking about okay, and by the way, so that would be culturally, if you will, to a sense that food and culture are other things that they feel Jewish. So let me ask you a question, and this just happened this week. It's all like I love my life as a rabbi. A couple comes in, the congregants, one is Jewish, one is not Jewish. The one who is not Jewish, they have 2 young children, absolutely feels Jewish. Absolutely rejected Catholicism a long time ago. Absolutely feels Jewish. Should we consider that person Jewish? Nobody converted. No, well, one is born Jewish, the other one not born Jewish, not convert, but has been in a Jewish family, married for 20 years, right? Feels Jewish. And by the way, has anti-Catholic sentiment based on a lot of issues of life and feels negative towards institutions, defining who that person is. Are they Jewish? Mark wants to say yes. And why not? And by the way, Ben-Gurion honestly had that approach as well when it came to defining who is a Jew coming to Israel. Whoever says they're a Jew. Like if you're willing to admit you're a Jew, like we'll take you. So why do we need boundaries? And by the way, so we're exploring. I'm not going to answer those questions, but I'm trying to provoke, right, an approach and question about what does it mean to be Jewish. All right, Cheryl. So actions speak louder than words. What does that mean? But how many Jews do I know who don't observe Shabbat? Are they Jewish? What does it mean to be Jewish? I once had somebody who came to convert and wanted to convert, literally I'm telling you, as a cultural Jew. They said, look, Rabbi, I don't believe in God, but I believe in the Jewish people. Right? I've been involved with the Jewish people for 20 years. I love the Jewish people. I'm telling you, like the history, like all this, not believe in God. Here's one of the questions I have. Should someone be allowed to convert to be Jewish who doesn't believe in God? No, they say, I don't believe in God. I believe in the Jewish people. So look, I took you one step up. The first step, Dina, was where somebody just says they're Jewish, and Mark says, why do we have boundaries? All right, so that one was like, you might say, look, we need rituals to define things, and, to become an American citizen. My wife, who was born in Canada, came here at age 3, as American as they come. Sorry? Well, you can talk about benefits, but we have rituals, right? You have to be sworn in, and there are rituals that define that relationship. But now I'm taking Dina a step up. So now I'm saying, not that they're just saying that they want to be Jewish, right? And they're saying to themselves, you have to accept me for who I am. I'm willing to convert. I want to be one with the Jewish people. I like the history of the Jewish people. It's not about persecution. I'm proud of what the Jewish people have accomplished. Amazing people. And I love being able to celebrate even holidays, Cheryl, sometimes with the family, but I'm certainly not observant in that way. I don't keep kosher. I don't believe in God. I want to convert. Now, by the way, hold on. Right? That could be, 20% of the congregation here? Look, what's the test? If I gave that test to congregants, how many would fail that test? No, but so what does it mean to be Jewish? Yeah, so what does it mean? So, good. So, again, Israeli and Jewish is this, I don't want to get there. It's very complicated because most of them can't separate Israeli and Jewish identity. For them, it's one and the same. And, of course, they're Jewish. And for them, Jewish is a peoplehood condition. It's not a religion. But the question is, they're part of that peoplehood condition. But what about someone else who said, I just don't believe in God? Traditionally, you want them to believe in God. Yeah. No one asks what, sorry? Oh, right. No one asks a Jew by birth whether you... Right, and we expect, and by the way, this is interesting between Orthodox Judaism and non-Orthodox traditions. Orthodox Judaism tends to require complete observance of all commandments, where non-Orthodox will say this is part of the journey. And by the way, it's not that we're taking an easier road. The truth of the matter is this goes back to a debate between Hillel and Shammai 2,000 years ago about whether they have to fulfill all the mitzvot or just the lighter ones, and then you grow into it. How do you expect someone to take everything on before? That's an enormous task. But right, so what is it? The question, what does it mean to be Jewish? Mark, you're going to say something. Correct. Conversion, look, again, I don't want to get stuck here in terms of whether there's a test or not. The question is trying to define, whether there's a litmus test is what we're asking about conversion. By the way, no one ever speak about being a Muslim without belief in Allah. No one ever think about being a Christian without belief in Jesus. And by the way, Jesus as your Savior, right? That's just is part and parcel of it. But being Jewish is quite different. You want to hear some statistics about Jews and belief? All right, okay. So this comes from a Pew report last year. So Americans in general, 80% believe in God. All Americans, right? Religious, non-religious, like across the board. Okay, 80% believe in God. But here we get a little bit more fascinating. 56% believe in God as described in the Bible. 23% believe in concept of some higher power or spiritual force. That's 56 believe in what we call the traditional concept of God, if you will. Right? 23 who believe in some higher power. 19% who don't believe in God. Okay? 19%. Oh, no, sorry. So that's the 80%. 56, 23. Of the 19%, so there's 80% who believe in God. The 19%, it doesn't come out always to 100%, don't believe in God. 10%, let me start with this one. 9% believe in a concept of a higher power, who said they don't believe in God. And 10 said don't believe in a higher power or spiritual force. Okay, I'm going to get more interesting. Hold on. Agnostics in the survey. Agnostics. 18% believe in a higher power, spiritual force, and define themselves as being agnostic. Now, where do the Jews fall in? You think they run the course about traditional Jewish belief? And that, or no? No? You think they're lower? Oh, yeah. By the way, what they say about surveys and Jews taking these religious surveys is that when it comes to Catholics, Protestants, other religious traditions, the answers they give versus their real life, there's often a dissonance between those. And what they've decided with Jews is we have no problem being honest about our lack of belief. Isn't that interesting? So Jews, belief in God, right, in a biblical God, 33%. 33%, as opposed to, by the way, Christians, 80%. Right, and this is all Jews. Orthodox are included in this. That's exactly right. Right, 33% in the biblical God. 56% of Jews believe in that higher power spiritual force. We're going to talk about that. 1%, it's unclear what they believe. And 10% don't believe in any of that higher power stuff. All right? So I'm going to come back to the notion about God. I just wanted you to get a landscape in terms of the struggle and where Jews really are. So let's go back to the question of what does it mean to be Jewish then, based on the statistics. So what does it mean to be Jewish? Can you be Jewish and not believe in God? Most of you, is there anybody who would want to say no, that you can't be Jewish and not believe in God? Like that's just not possible? Anybody want to argue that? Or not? I mean, Michael, would you? Okay. Greg? Right. And so where does God fit in there? Where does God fit in there? Where does God fit in that continuum? Is it required? Do you believe that belief in God is required to be Jewish? You know what, right? No, and by the way, I want to acknowledge language for a moment. Michael distinguished, he used two terms. I don't know if you caught it. Judaism and Jewishness. So by the way, Jewishness, I use that word a lot. And autocorrect, right? The spell check says there's no such word. In fact, you look in the dictionary, there's no such word. There's no such word as Jewishness. It doesn't accept it. But I use that word a lot. Judaism, I think we'd all agree, is somehow the prescribed system. By the way, one could argue culturally or religiously, Judaism of a system of what it means to be Jewish. And the Jewishness, Michael, is an interesting word, right? To feel that sense of connection, but not sure what it is. And so we're going to get to it. Cheryl. Is it part of the stage of life belief in God? Cheryl, is that what you're suggesting? Or Jewish? Right. Because Scott's still waiting to hit that stage. Right? It's somewhere after puberty, somewhere, but right, Scott? It's like you're waiting for it to hit. So one of the saddest stories I have, I don't know if some of you may know the stories about a woman who had cancer and who's a scientist and wanted and knew, by the way, that the statistics seem to show that people who have belief, right, in God have better rates of recovery and healing. Right? There's something about belief. And she wanted to believe. She was in her 40s, late 40s, early 50s. And she would come sometimes at services. She tried. After services, we'd go up to the ark. We'd open it up, do a prayer. And this, like, for about 3-4 years as she fought cancer. And I remember visiting her at the very end. She was laying on the couch. And you know, it was just a matter, really, of days. She was in hospice care. And she looked at me and she just said, "Rabbi, I just wish I could have believed." Like, and here's somebody who really wanted to believe, Cheryl, like, and just. So we're going to go back to the Jewishness. I want to go back to Jewishness for a moment, though. Go ahead.
One of the things that I love most about Judaism is my idea of it being
A very big tent. Okay.
So what being Jewish is, I think, is different for different people.
So what being Jewish means is very different for different people. Terrific.
My daughter-in-law.
Your daughter-in-law.
Who was not Jewish when she came to our family.
Right. Not Jewish when she came to your family.
But now has gone through this journey over the last 4 or 5 years with you.
Right.
There was some point in my relationship with Tiffany, who I love dearly, before she actually knew her, that we were talking about something. And I told her, you're Jewish as far as I'm concerned. You're Jewish with everything but the certificate.
Right. Jewish, but everything but a certificate.
And that's how I looked at her, and that's how I felt about it. And I realized that she needed to take the step, and it was a different thing. But there's something else involved in it.
So there's some feeling. Mark, go ahead. Yeah. So it's right. So as a psychologist, you believe it's more the connection people than the belief. You know, there are these studies, and they're double-blind studies, right, that say people don't know they're being prayed for, and others who do know, and there's a connection, and it's been right, but it's been debunked a little bit. Some of the post sort of commentary on it, but there is a sense of they do talk a lot about caring community being the healing force rather than belief. But some of the studies are just about belief, by the way, about prayer. Okay, but go ahead. Second point. Right. So the boundaries clearly mark where we come from, right? And I get it. Like when you start creating boundaries, right, you create obstacles. Right? And you start creating problems in terms of why not just accept people who say they're Jewish. Now, most of you know that the problem is that Judaism is, by and large, a legal system, a rabbinic legal system that says, much like our example here in the United States, that we have certain requirements towards that, what we would define someone to become Jewish or American or whatever that means. And by the way, this comes back from an early time. I want you to think about the ancient world in which you were one and the same of your culture, right? Like if you were a Roman and you were, let's say in Syria at the time, like the, first century BCE, right? You'd never say you're a Syrian, just even after being there for 5 years, right? You're a Roman because you believed in Roman ideals and you believed in the Roman gods and you held on to them. And so, right, Judaism is the only system that transferred, if you will, and stayed from the ancient tradition to the modern tradition. It's the only people that survives this, if you will, journey to modernity. Does that make sense? In which all of the ideas and gods and everything are part of who they are as a people. Linda. Right? Right. Right. There's these Ashkenazic genes that are passed on. We know that. And by the way, if you don't know, there is a genetic marker, and they've known this for a long time, for Kohanim. Right? Male Kohanim. They can actually test your Kohen status based on a genetic marker. Now, that's pretty amazing. So this notion of what it means to be Jewish is not really tested until emancipation, right? In the 18th century, of when Jews were given the right to become citizens of the country they were living in. At that time, the first country was France. And Napoleon offers them, they convene a so-called Sanhedrin, ask questions. I want to say 19 questions that were asked, and if they would answer them satisfactorily. There was even one, by the way, about intermarriage. Would Israelites deem fit to marry a French woman? And what they said, the rabbis were very creative, Ben. Right? These rabbis said there's nothing that would prohibit such a marriage. Now, it's not that they said they would sanction it. Not to say they didn't believe in it, but they knew that answer was the difference between citizenship and not. And so, like good rabbis, they sort of figured out how to answer it with somehow holding on to their integrity as well. Now, what this means, though, is once it's not that the shtetl walls fall down, is that those Jews are actually allowed to now be accepted and integrated into the world at large. And so, they have to ask, and now, Charles, for the first time, they're allowed to say, I want to reject the religious idea of what it means to be Jewish. It's the first time. Before that, if you were going to do that, you were a peopleless, person. Imagine like a citizen without a country. That's what you were like. Because other civilizations, other communities didn't want you because you were Jewish. And so there hardly any chance of survival. You'd have to hide somehow in that Jewish identity. There were people who did that. You could, of course, convert. I mean, there are plenty of Jews who convert to Christianity, though, and who enter into the mainstream, right? Early on as well that happens. But it's the first time that you could keep your Jewish identity and reject the religious component of being Jewish. Now, as a result of that, how did Jews begin to define their Jewishness? What movements that are created really in the beginning middle of the 19th century, of the 1800s, in which Jews are involved with define their values? What are those movements? You know it. What is it? Zionism. That's exactly right. Zionism. It means we don't have to believe, we don't have to be religious Jews, but we believe in the Jewish people as a people, and hence we want to return to our homeland. And that's exactly right. And so a lot of the Zionists, early Zionists, are not religious Jews. Now, originally, Jews who returned to Israel, by the way, even when it was forbidden to do so, and those who go during the Ottoman Empire and even earlier, right, they're religious Jews. They for sure are religious Jews who believe, by the way, in different times that the Messiah will come, and this is like ingathering of the Jews as a religious movement. But it's the first time as a secular enterprise, and Herzl being one of them, right? He's your ancestor. But others, right? Non-religious, secular Zionists. Isn't that fascinating, right? That's one of them, yes. You're trying to. Okay, I'm going to tell you other ones that you know about. Jews were known to be involved in what political groups in the 19th century? In Europe and then in the United States as well. Communism. Anarchists, we're not going to get there. We'll just hold on for a moment. Let's stick for communism for a moment. Some of the top communist leaders are Jewish. Because they believed that the communal obligations, right, were reflective of the Jewish values, right? It meant that you were all comrades. Right? It meant, and they believed this is how you translate what does it mean to be Jewish. So here's what I want to understand. The question that we're asking, what does it mean to be Jewish, they were struggling with, and they found different answers. Isn't that fascinating? And the comrade, by the way, was universal. You didn't have to be Jewish because Judaism has a universal component to it. Of course we have that. And that's why they were willing to say, yeah, you can have anybody who pledges to that communist satellite. We're one. We're brothers and comrades. Okay, good. That's the second one. What's the third one? Close to communism? Socialism. Right? How many of you had relatives here in the United States who were diehard Jewish socialists? Right? Right? These are the people, by the way, who created very often the unions. Certainly in the garment industry and places like these were socialists who believed the what? The what? Repeat, I can't hear. Oh, yeah, right. All of the, I didn't recognize the initials, but all those, right, very often Jews were at the forefront of them because they believed in equality, which we talk about, fair wages. They believed in a society in which people were taken care of, and the state had the obligation to take care of those people. And by the way, in the 40s, most Jews were democratic socialists. Absolutely. Yeah, and there are, right, so by the way, what does it mean, right, anarchists as well? It's a minor movement, and I don't want to forget about them, but we talk about how a large group of Jews define their Jewishness, right? Anarchists, yes, but again, the larger ones are definite. There was a hand over here as well. I said, no? Yes, Michael, go ahead, as long as I give you the chance. Go ahead. So religious issues didn't matter, but Israel
was first important.
Right.
And I didn't grow up in a very religious home.
So, No, I think I think those are important concepts in terms of what does it mean to be Jewish. And so what I want to first suggest as we go down this journey is it's nothing new, right? The struggles that we have, Scott, are nothing new. No, but is it? Because we tend to think, oh, this is the first generation that we've had to deal with X. Or the first generation we've had to deal with, but the truth of the matter is, right, for like almost 200 years ago, 170 years ago, they were struggling through these issues as well. How to define Jewishness separate from, right? Now, let's talk about God for a moment. And why is it you think that Jews are, let's talk about American Jews. Because that's really what we're talking about. Because, by the way, in other countries, it's not quite as stark about belief, about not believing in God. We don't have the surveys necessarily, but not as stark. Why do you think here in America less focus on God? Holocaust. So I want you to imagine, right, in the years following the Holocaust, if you're a rabbi, how do you talk about God? Who would be audacious enough to start trying to rationalize anything about God because no one can think about God in any other context than the Holocaust? And I think that's a very strong reason, Rob, is that, right, and so what happens is there's a whole generation or two that take a hiatus in their Jewish identity with an emphasis on God as well. Right? In Orthodox circles, by the way, it's different. And they'll talk about it's God's will and we can't know God's will. They can live in a different context, if you will. But for most modern Jews, Scott, they just like, how do you talk about God? And how do you make sense of it? Like, you can't. So I believe that that's one. Other possibilities about why, American Jews focus less on God. Lori? Yeah, so socioeconomic success, right? When you are, the more successful a people is, right? Often, belief change. And by the way, we know socioeconomic attitudes about childbearing, the number of children that are born. It's interesting. You'd think that the more money you have, the more children you'd have. But as societies become more enlightened, more educated and better off, it is like fewer children, and that's a phenomenon, worldwide. Socioeconomic issues. So we're talking about success now, right? Certainly from the 1940s on as well. Other possibilities. And predates birth control. Correct. As a doctor, right, it's great to bring out those issues, and that clearly now there is a way to make it easier to engage in birth control. Even before that, there are smaller families, correct. And they're like, by the way, we have, I don't know if you ever know this, in the Talmud, they talk about birth control methods. Talk about a sponge. Yeah, they talk about, they know about some birth control. Isn't it amazing, like the knowledge they had back then? Anita, did you... So great. We become more internationalized, certainly in America, in terms of questioning, and Jews would just they were willing to bifurcate those lives they had. Right? Judaism and that belief, and it may not make sense in the rational world, but that's what Jews do. And then it changes. Right? And then all of a sudden people start to say, well, wait, why does it have to be that way? By the way, again, if you don't know a little bit about the conservative movement, it grows out of, the movement begins as an intellectual movement called Wissenschaftsjudentum in German, the scientific study of Judaism. And it actually begins with non-Jewish Protestant and other areas of study in which they're willing to apply critical study method to religious text and tradition. And it's the first time it happens to be able to look at it in terms of literature. And doesn't matter. And that's where then the documentary hypothesis, right? The Wellhausen, which hypothesizes that the Torah is actually a couple of different traditions that have been woven together a long time ago. And that leads way to having an intellectually honest, as we would say, Judaism, of where we can question and answer it, and we're not afraid of the answers, right, that may seem to contradict a tradition. But all these are true. Mark, you had your hand up. Well, again, when they believe in God, so here's what we're going to get to now. This is the perfect transition. Thank you. So I said Jews believe only 33% in the biblical concept of God. All right? So here's the other, and 56% define God as a higher power, spiritual force. And I want to get back now to the atheists, right, or the agnostics, who actually, right, of the 19%, almost half said they actually believed, right, in something of a higher force or power. Okay, a different report. Fewer Jews than Christians believe that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and loves everyone. 70% of Jews believe God is all-loving. 70% of Jews believe that God is all-loving. 70% of Jews, yes. Right, of those, I think that'd be clear then. Fewer than 40% believe God is all-powerful. Fewer than 40%. Right? 49 say God is all-knowing. Only 30% of Jews believe that God possesses of all three attributes, right, of all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful. Mark. Repeat that, Mark. The Holocaust?
The impact of the Holocaust may be, yes, there's still a God, but the God is not as powerful and omniscient as we thought.
So the impact is powerful. In fact, that's where the theology, Rubinstein and others, it's called the death of God theology. And not that God died, but the God that you thought you knew is no longer, right? That's not the God you can believe in anymore. Elie Wiesel has issues. Scott.
So when they talk about the biblical image of God, in Judaism, I don't really know what that is. I mean, the biblical image of God in Christianity is the guy with the white beard or corporeal vision of God in Jesus. I don't see that in Judaism. I don't see a biblical vision of God that is any different from a spiritual vision of God.
So traditional Judaism would see God, right, as being, by the way, traditional qualities, we don't tend to say all-loving, it's interesting, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good. Right? You're shaking your head as a modern, right? Cheryl's going, no, I don't buy all those. But by the way, those were the classic. The biblical God was a vengeful God. He was vengeful for justice. Meant that he was a God who was a just God, and people were punished who didn't live up to those standards. But he's all good because when people deserve good, they get it. If you don't deserve good, you're not going to get it. Right? Can you be a good parent and punish a kid? Of course you can. Cheryl, you live like that. I know, you're looking at me like, of course you can. Like, that's my whole child. That's my life with my children, right? And so you can still have a good God who exacts justice from people who don't live up to those requirements. So, Scott, there is this traditional idea of God, and I believe that's part of the problem. So part of the problem is, and now it's not your problem, it sounds like. You've got a different problem, doctor. But the problem is that when people, and that's where the notion about the agnostics come in, right, that say that, they believe, right, in a force, many of them, because many people will say, if you don't believe in the traditional concept of God, you don't believe in God. Right? That's for many people, You don't believe in that concept of God, and therefore they reject that traditional concept. That's what I find out from many people. Because they have a certain definition of God. God equals, it's a mathematical formula. God equals that God who is all-knowing, who controls human events, right? Who can, right, be involved in people's lives, who took the Israelites out of Egypt, who, like, that is the God by definition, and then they reject that definition. Yeah, that's very common, Anita. Rabbi Cardoza. God is not, okay, not a beneficent God. Is a huge relief. They can, no, and that's the idea. You can still believe in God if you take away the idea that everything that God does is good. So, Ben, that's the conflict. And by the way, I believe as well, like there are things that happen in my life of where, I'm one of those people, just so you know, I'll be honest with you, if I planned on going somewhere, unless it was absolutely essential, and I just was daydreaming and missed that off-ramp, I'm going to go, you know what, I wasn't supposed to go there today. Isn't that fascinating? It wasn't like, I didn't even think about it. It's one thing to think like, should I go there or not? I don't know if I need to. Even if it was purely an accident, right? I just, for some reason, because I know from my life as a rabbi, that life changes in a second, right? It's in a second, Ben, that life changes, right? If you're in a different street corner, right, at 132, right, and there's an accident at that corner when you weren't going to be, so, but Ben, is that irrational of me? Hold on.
I am actually in thinking about something for a long, long time. And forgive me for bringing up this way, but the meaning of the word believe.
The meaning of the word believe.
Does that mean something like a checkbox on a form that you check and you will never be erased? Or believe is something that I believe one way today and another way tomorrow? How long do I keep something that is categorized as belief?
Right. So belief, checkbox that you can check off, and by the way, I think that people would all argue, I think about the evolution. Who talked, right, Cheryl? I think belief in God is an evolution, right? That with life and experiences and age and all things, that our concepts of God change. And by the way, most importantly are the life experiences. The challenge, and the concept of God that we had. I've said this and I continue to say this. I believe that true belief only comes out of theological crisis. What I mean by that is where your idea of God is really challenged. Right? I think that's the real moment of where, in another context you say come to Jesus moment. But it's like a come to God moment. And you were going to say something? Humans have instincts, but yeah. And by the way, I believe in that instinct. I don't believe that applies in the car when I'm driving and I just daydream for a moment. Right. It's one of the. I believe in human instinct, but there's a moment which believes that like life unfolds in a way. It's like the movie. What is it called? Doors, closing doors, sliding doors. Right. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a fascinating movie of where is it Gwyneth Paltrow who's running for a subway, and as she's going to it, it goes split screen. One narrative is where she makes the train, and the other narrative is where she doesn't make the train and how different her life is. Right? It's a bizarre movie into that, but I believe that. I believe one moment, right, can make that difference. And so I'm going to admit it's irrational. Like this part of me is so irrational, but I don't know. I don't know how to deal with it. Go ahead. Sure, what we call the butterfly effect, right? Okay, do I believe in God or faith and trust? And so now I'm going to take us home for a little bit now and segue into this concept of what does it mean to have belief in God or not in terms of Judaism. All right, so here's where I'm going to turn it now. So here's what I tell you. The answer is yes, you can not believe in God and still be Jewish, but the caveat is, right, Judaism and the Jewish people won't survive without God. Right? It's just individuals can be Jewish and not believe in God, but the Jewish people and Judaism can't survive without God. Right? By the way, movements like ethical Judaism, they die out. They can't sustain themselves, right? Because and by the way, so in the Jewish tradition, we talk about the Jewish Trinity, if you will, is God, Torah, and Israel. I don't know if you've ever heard those as three important concepts, right? So God, Torah, right, which really means Jewish teaching. You don't have to keep it strictly as Torah. And God, Torah, Israel, but it's not the state of Israel. It's Israel is the Jewish people, right? Remember, we're called Bnei Israel, the Jewish people. And those three elements in some way have to be present. Right? By the way, that's what defines a civilization. I want to segue into Mordechai Kaplan now. Right? Civilizations are defined often by belief, belong, behave. Right? So if you study sociology a little bit, right? Belief, that you have some set of beliefs. Belong, there's some sense of peoplehood that you have, right? Belief, behave, right? The behave, I didn't say. Behave is you have some set of actions that you have. And by the way, apply it to America. Right? What does it mean to be American? We have what we believe are American values. We feel like Americans, sense of belonging. And we behave, by the way, 4th of July, Thanksgiving, other things that define what we would call American identity. And so the same thing is in Judaism, and that's you have to somehow connect. But what does it mean to believe in God? So that's the question. And so I have these great talks with my children, right, who are all sort of like in their 20s. My oldest now just 30. And we talk about God, about spiritual ideas about God. Right? And I'll share, spiritual ideas about life and belief. And I'll talk about, I believe in a force that's there. I believe the force that calls out to us. I don't understand where that force comes from. And somehow it is, and the reason that we have things in the Torah that we don't like slavery and other things that we would disagree with, it's not because God has changed, it's because our understanding of God has changed, and we just get God wrong very often. And so I talk about all these ideas, and they'll say, and for me, that's God. Then my kids will go, oh, whoa, stop right there. Because, no, you can't, once I label that thing as God, they don't believe in it. So Mordechai Kaplan, by the way, was often called, a Jewish atheist, if you will. Because he defined God as the force that makes for salvation. The force that makes for salvation. Now, salvation here is not the Christian concept of your soul being saved, but first of all, it's a force as opposed to this anthropomorphic image of God, that somehow there's something out there. And for salvation, that what he defines as that pushes humans to be good. That's the salvation, to be better, to strive to be better. If you look at Maslow and other models, we talk about that, the sort of pyramid of full fulfillment, right, of the self. And that humans have this desire. And some will argue that is, when you talk about a soul or a sense of God's presence in us, that that's what that is. But Mordecai Kaplan took a lot of flack by Orthodox for saying, like, you're just not Jewish. They burned his Passover Haggadah, by the way. They burned his Passover Haggadah publicly in the streets because they so were. Right, you think about what burning meant. I believe, by the way, this is before the Holocaust, by the way. I want to say it was in the 30s, maybe. But the idea of burning books, which it seems so anti-Jewish, that they would do that. So what is it? So to be Jewish, by the way, and for Judaism to survive and to be self-perpetuating to the next generation, I believe there has to be some idea of that which is beyond us and is a force that makes for good, if you will, or that moves us in a certain direction, right? Or in some way is what was traditionally called God. And what when Mordecai Kaplan was attacked for not believing in God, he says, no, you don't understand. I'm simply redefining what has always been redefined in human history. Sherry. Look, the whole notion about teaching God is a very different question, but I always say that God is not in talking or teaching, it's about in moments. Right? That is, it's a recognition. So I always say, years ago, and I think, Rabbi, Linda, you took a class I taught on theology, right? Did you take, I think, creating a personal theology? I seem to recall that you were in that class. And I always say, whether I teach teens or adults, I say, we've studied lots of theology. If at the end of this class, right, it hasn't translated into something, then I have failed. If this is simply an academic class in learning about theology, then I feel like I failed because I want the study of theology to actually impact people and how they perceive the world and to integrate that, whatever pieces of other theologies, into their life view. And so Sherry, and I saw it at your face, that moments, right, that is, and I'll give you an example. Orthodox will say, right, if there's a moment, they'll say, Baruch Hashem. What does Baruch Hashem mean? Blessed is God's name, literally. But it means that, right, that God's in that moment. Right? It's a beautiful sunset. Baruch Hashem. You can, but it is a thank you, God, but it's also an acknowledgement of God. But it's like, by the way, sometimes it's even inconclusive, right? How are you feeling today? Baruch Hashem. Yeah, but it's the, okay, no, I'm not disagreeing with you, right? But somehow you read into those brackets, I'm good. And rather than saying, I'm good, all you'd have to say is, thank God. That becomes the God moment. Right? So how do you talk about, right? So it can't be just about believing in God. There's got to be moments in which actually that belief, right, if you will, is present in the moment. Not just intellectually, but if you will, in a real way. Right? And I tried that with my kids. I don't know if I succeeded or not, but to say, I feel like this is a God moment. Like I feel God's presence in some way. That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer. If somebody, would you know if somebody's Orthodox and they've just been diagnosed with cancer, would they say Baruch Hashem? They would not. But by the way, in our tradition, you're supposed to bless God for the bad as well. Yep. Because, by the way, to do so is to create, to not do so is to somehow live a life of dualism, of where something else, right? It's, by the way, Oseh Shalom V'Oreh Tara, right, from the prophets, who makes good and who creates evil as well. And yet, we've talked about before where the rabbis changed that in the language. Ben, you know this in the Siddur, right? That we have, Oseh Shalom Varei et Hakol, right? Who created good and everything else. You know, they were, by the way, the rabbis were not above changing things that they, you know, in terms of how they wanted to be God to be perceived. And I think that's part of this tradition. But how we talk about God is so important because I'm telling you, today, right, just amazing, my day, right? 2 different experiences today. One began with a guy saying, I'm Jewish, but I don't believe anything. And then to have kids to be able to think about to challenge themselves about God and to help them, right, have that sense of what God is about that doesn't seem to contradict, right, their common sense. So I said, I don't believe that God, because, somebody talked about this, asked me about God speaking to people. And I said, do you wonder sometimes if God used to speak to people like Abraham, Isaac, and Rebecca, and others, why God doesn't speak to people today? And somebody said, we said God does, but in a different way than it was understood in the Bible. So that's when they say about the biblical idea of God, that's what they're talking about, right? A God that actually you can hear that voice literally, orally at Mount Sinai. Or was there some religious, spiritual experience that took place that their own manifestation of that event is to hear the voice of God? But what does it mean to hear the voice of God? It's not Charlton Heston, right? By the way, this is great from the Prince of Egypt. I don't know if you ever saw that. It was the animated version, one of the first ones by DreamWorks. And I remember I was in attendance. Jeffrey Katzenberg was actually doing tests. The movie hadn't been done yet, but they had some scenes and the concepts, and they were testing it for focus groups of rabbis. Because, I don't know if you remember this, it came out right after Pocahontas, which was a disaster, a PR disaster for them because of how it portrayed the Native American community. And they didn't want that to happen in terms of Jews and Christians because they're like this holy book. So they brought us in, and they shared with us that they had tried to, the original idea about the voice of God was supposed to be an amalgamation, a synthesis of all the voices of the characters, as if to say God's voice is everybody. But apparently when they did that, it just sounded so horrible that they couldn't use it. And I forget whose voice they lay over as like the major track, but it was like, how do you perceive, what does it mean to hear God's voice? And even DreamWorks, right, Katzenberg, wanted somehow to send a message about what God is about. It's fascinating. Somebody had a hand up that I missed. Anita first. Depends how you want to define God, though, right? So, right, I'm going to say God is open to almost any interpretation that allows for some force or something that is part of the universe of which humans can relate to that force and that speaks to us and wants something of us. How do I handle, okay, I want to be Jewish but don't believe in God? I don't have an answer, I'm going to be honest with you. There are some, one prominent local rabbi, I won't acknowledge him because we're being recorded, but who is well respected, but who advocates for accepting even an atheist convert. Right? That is, if you want to join the Jewish people, like, we want you. Right, because we are part of a people, and we want you to be with us, even if you don't share all of those ideas, but if you're bound up together with us. So I don't have an answer for all of this. Still in process. All right, Mark, and then we're going to finish this up. Wait, do you want to respond to this idea? Mark will hold on for a moment. Go ahead. 33% believed in a biblical God. No, absolutely not. Correct. Yeah, look, it's not completely consistent. I'm sure there are many Orthodox Jews who believe, but by the way, it's harder to be an Orthodox Jew and not to believe in that biblical God. It's harder because you want to believe in the commandedness of the commandments. And you want to believe that a voice came forth and made that commandment. Right? So it's much harder. It's not impossible, right, in the Orthodox world. And I'm much more comfortable to say that our tradition has developed as the human response to God's call. The Torah is our perception of the world through hearing and feeling that voice of God that is not anthropomorphic in nature, right? But and it's our struggle to perceive God. So by the way, right? If again, to go back to slavery, if slavery is absolutely wrong, why is it permitted in the Torah? If God permitted it in the Torah, does that mean that God changed God's mind? But by the way, most people, you're saying, God, you so flippantly said Torah is written by people, right? That'll have you thrown out of many Jewish institutions. So, but there's God's words. Any errors are our fault. That's absolutely correct. That's why they will, right, they're able to validate with things that are clear errors in the text. They'll say the humans, right, did that. But here's a value. And so did God change God's mind? Or it's a conflict, right? And I just buy into the idea that we understand and we hear God's voice differently based on our own evolution of ideas and humanity. But it's easy how you live in that world, Scott. And yet, you're still not sure. Your question is, what do I believe in? So, Mark, and then I'll tie this together. Go ahead. So God being inside us as opposed to God being out there as a force of nature. So this is like classic, distinction of God being transcendent and immanent, right? Right? That God which is part of us and involved in our lives, and that which is an external force, the God of creation, if you will, but somehow is not involved in the human process. And I believe that God's involved in the human process, but I don't believe at all that God gives people cancer. Right? Nor do I believe, really, Ben, that, I certainly don't believe when people are in accidents that they deserved it. Right? I don't believe that, that God's punishing people in that way. But I do believe God's part of us because I believe in that breath of life, that soul, that image, right? The DNA of the universe, if you will, is sort of in us, however that's evolved. But I also believe that there's a force. So it would be compared to Kaplan's idea of God, which I, in my own understanding, would be, imagine like a compass which directs you towards magnetic north. That our souls are designed, in the evolution, if you will, and the connection with God, to direct us towards that, right? To that northern element of God. Now, by the way, you can't see magnetic north, but somehow a magnetized, needle or metal object will be able to find it. And so for me, and by the way, that's why we have to speak of God and belief very often in metaphor and stories. Right? That's why the Hasidim love to tell stories about God. And God's perceived in so many different ways, and you know this, right? It is because you can't think about it in logic and reason. That's not going to bring about belief. Philosophy, theology is not going to bring about belief. Metaphor and how we apply it and how we connect, that's going to. Yeah, sure. You go ahead. So people who come to the Ark, you talk about in Yom Kippur, when it's open, Look, there is, here, I'm going to respond to an answer, and then I'll tie it together, because it's out there, is when you went, Scott, to the Western Wall, to the Kotel, right, Scott? Did you feel something there? Something you never felt before. And I only know because Scott went with me. We went together to Israel. And you felt something there. And yet, by the way, right? So, and Scott's sitting here saying, like, I'm not sure what I believe, but I felt something. Look, it's a sense, and that's what I'm telling you, is that when people answer the question, do they believe in God, they're answering it intellectually. They're answering it from the standpoint, like, do I intellectually believe that I believe in God? Well, the definition I have doesn't fit into that category, or I don't believe that I have, but there are moments in which they actually, if they would reflect, perceive and feel God. For me, that's at least how I approach it. So spirituality, right? And here's where I would differ. And here's, I think, Mark may tie into the distinction is, I believe that the notion of God is only effective and utilitarian if it actually translates into something external. Is that it makes the world a better place. Not just that I'm a better person. Right? Not that I feel more connected to the world. Right? That's where, and again, this is me. This is me talking. Right? I didn't want to say this is Judaism. I have to be very careful. I see your face going like, I don't agree with that. I'm just saying for me, right, the understanding of what it means to be self-fulfilled, some would argue that that's narcissistic. It's the very definition of being self-fulfilled. Now, I don't want to put spirituality in that pool at all, but to understand how one can take it that way. And I believe for me, and that's where it's a force that makes for salvation, that makes for good. It's not just me, but it's actually directed out into the world. And for me, that's where we find God. Go ahead. Last question. I know I always keep saying the last question. Well, we're not going to share ideas. Is it a question or no? Okay, phrase it as a question. If somebody too culturally Jewish look, belief, like, I can't say, like I just said before, can you be Jewish and not believe in God? Yes. Can you be self-fulfilled and be spiritual? Is it a bad thing? No. I mean, but ultimately, right, I believe in terms of what God is about for me, is that it becomes most powerful, that concept, when it's directed outward. So I hope I wasn't too circuitous in terms of the route that we took. Did I answer? Is there any question I left unanswered? What, the first one, do you have to believe to be Jewish? Which one? At what age do you tell children? That wasn't even part of this officially. Yeah, so I believe, I'm a student of Jerome Bruner, educator, philosopher, who talks about spiral education. Have you ever heard that term? Yeah, when I studied education in the 70s, it's a very popular idea, that the idea that you can teach a child anything at any age, basically. It means that, by the way, you can teach algebra to a 7-year-old. Now, you can't really teach algebra to a 7-year-old. I barely got it in 7th grade. But what it means is you can introduce the concept of the unknown to a 7-year-old, right? That X quantity where I was like, what do you mean you got letters of the alphabet in a mathematical formula? I couldn't understand that. And so I believe, right, that you can introduce complex ideas early on, and you have to let them evolve over time, and that's actually sometimes beneficial to plant those seeds early, But by the way, it's important for them still to hold on to the myth. And by the way, here, myth is not a made-up tradition. Myth is the accepted traditions and narrative of a people, and to hold them as sacred and still help them understand them. And so I don't know that age. It's a fascinating, right, possibility. We'll have to leave that for the cosmos. Anyway, I want to thank you all. It was a pleasure to study and to share with you, all right? Baruch Tia, thank you. But not individual. Yeah, look, my hope in these always is, like, I hope that you'll never agree with everything that I say. I hope that you'll actually disagree with things that I say, because I want you to challenge, right, your own belief system. And so you can't take my theology, right? You have to create your, exactly. And so I'm hoping that there's some idea tonight. That's the definition of right there. Mark, I want you to come back. You were great. It was a pleasure. All right, take care, everybody. Good night.